More than $100 million in diamonds, jewelry, and cash had vanished from a vault beneath Antwerp. But the company monitoring its alarm system reported the vault as secure. On Monday, February 17th, Diamond Squad investigators found the 3-ton door open and over 100 safe deposit boxes forced. The thieves had beaten 10 layers of security without triggering a response. The crime scene gave detectives no reason to look for one broken lock. They had to explain how the crew crossed several defenses without producing the signal that mattered. Patrick Pays and Ajim de Broeker were the officers called to the Antwerp Diamond Center that morning. The vault sat 2 floors underground in the middle of a district that treated security as part of daily life. Police watched the surrounding streets around the clock. Private guards controlled the building, and cameras covered the area outside. Yet the vault door was open. The floor was littered with cash and jewelry cases, and investigators could see that the crew had spent enough time inside to attack a large portion of the boxes. The scene didn't look like a lucky burglary that had suddenly gone right. The thieves had reached the most protected room in the building, worked there for hours, and left before anyone arrived to interrupt them. Investigators also found no simple piece of destruction that explained the entry. The door hadn't been blown apart, and the monitoring company had never treated the vault as compromised. That forced a different question. Instead of asking which single defense had failed, detectives had to ask how several defenses could be made useless at the same time. The setting made that question especially strange. Wired later reported that about 80% of the world's rough diamonds passed through Antwerp's 3-block diamond district, which was watched by 63 video cameras and 24-hour police surveillance. The business itself created an awkward security problem. Diamonds worth a fortune could move between offices in a small bag, so the district had to protect extraordinary value without freezing the trade that depended on constant movement. The Diamond Center's underground vault was supposed to solve the hardest part of that problem. Its steel door weighed about 3 tons. The vault system used 10 layers of security, including infrared heat detection, Doppler radar for movement, a seismic sensor, magnetic monitoring around the door, cameras, and a combination lock with 100 million possible combinations. Wired reported that the door itself carried 6 separate protections. Any burglar who defeated one protection was still supposed to run into another. A strong door and a trustworthy alarm solve different problems. The door can remain physically intact while the device watching it receives misleading information. A motion detector can work perfectly and still contribute nothing if it is blocked from seeing motion. A camera can be recording normally and still become useless if the recording disappears before investigators can examine it. In this vault, the redundancy depended on one layer noticing enough to compensate when another layer failed. The Diamond Center had invested heavily in individual defenses, but those defenses still had interfaces between them. The door depended on its locks and sensors. The sensors depended on the alarm circuit. The alarm company depended on the signals coming out of that circuit. Guards depended partly on cameras and alarms to tell them where attention was needed. A patient attacker didn't have to make every component weak. He could look for the places where one component trusted information produced by another. The design made sense because no single device was trusted to protect everything. A heavy door could resist physical attack while sensors watched for tampering. Cameras could record who came and went. Guards controlled access above ground. The alarm network was supposed to turn unusual activity into a response before anyone had time to empty boxes. Notarbartolo's tenant status exposed a problem the hardware wasn't designed to solve. Access control and anomaly detection solve different problems. One decides who is allowed through a boundary. The other decides whether an allowed person is doing something dangerous. Notarbartolo's tenant status didn't open the vault for him, but it reduced the number of moments when his presence looked abnormal. Each ordinary visit gave him more information without forcing him to test the defenses under the pressure of a single night. That made legitimate access useful, long before any lock was touched. The Guardian reported at the time that Belgian authorities said Leonardo Notarbartolo rented an office in the Diamond Center in November 2000, more than 2 years before the robbery. He presented himself as an Italian gem dealer and had legitimate access to his own safe deposit box in the vault. Wired later described him buying small stones, meeting dealers, and using the building in the ordinary way a tenant would. Legitimate access kept Notarbartolo inside the first security perimeter and exposed him to the building's routines without requiring him to behave like an intruder. Guards saw a tenant. Over repeated visit, he could learn the normal flow of people, the sequence of doors, the routines around the vault, and the difference between a busy weekday and a quiet weekend. Wired's reporting describes turnstiles and private security at the building entrance, with tenants using identification to pass through. That meant the first layer of security was doing exactly what it had been designed to do when Notarbartolo entered. It recognized an authorized tenant and let him through. From there, he could make legitimate trips to his own box and observe the environment from the same side of the perimeter as the people the building trusted. The evidence points to long-term reconnaissance from inside the first perimeter. There's no evidence that a guard simply opened the vault for him on robbery night. The advantage came earlier. Familiarity reduced the amount of reconnaissance that had to be done while trespassing, and it allowed the crew to prepare around routines rather than improvising against them. The entrance controls were good at screening unfamiliar people, but repeated tenant visits gave guards fewer reasons to treat his observation as suspicious. Years later, Notarbartolo gave Wired a long account of how the robbery was supposedly commissioned and how the crew studied the vault. He claimed another dealer paid him to determine whether the place could be robbed, then described an elaborate reconnaissance effort and a replica of the vault used for practice. Those claims remain disputed. Investigators and later researchers have challenged parts of his story, especially his explanation for the combination lock and the alleged outside mastermind. The office and his vault access are easier to verify. By February 2003, he had spent years inside the building. He would later be convicted of robbing. Repeated legitimate access made the vault easier to study over time. The crew could turn a huge security problem into specific questions. What did the guards notice? Which sensors watched the door? Which devices watched the room? What happened on weekends? Which parts of the system relied on another part already having detected a problem? The vault's redundancy was designed to make one failure survivable. The thieves therefore had to interfere with different protections in ways that kept the overall system from recognizing the combined attack. Exactly how they managed every step is still uncertain. The physical evidence and later accounts show that surveillance was disrupted, security recordings disappeared, and sensors that should have detected activity were prevented from doing their normal jobs. Somehow, the crew also obtained the access needed to get through the main vault door without leaving the kind of damage a brute force attack would have produced. The evidence also helps separate what police could observe from what came later through Notarbartolo's storytelling. Investigators found signs that parts of the alarm wiring had been manipulated and that monitoring devices had been bypassed. Contemporary reporting said the vault door hadn't been forced. Those are crime scene facts. The exact order in which the thieves handled individual sensors, the way they learned the combination, and the claim that they trained on a full replica depend much more heavily on later reconstruction. Wired's reconstruction gives one useful example of that distinction. The article describes the alarm circuit as sending an electrical pulse into the vault and expecting a return signal with a break in the circuit meant to trigger the alarm. Police later found insulation stripped from the main inbound and outbound wires. Notarbartolo claimed the crew bridged those wires, so the pulse returned before reaching the sensors. The stripped wiring belonged to the physical crime scene. The exact bridge procedure came from his later account. Together with the monitoring company's Monday reading, the evidence supports manipulation of the signal path without requiring every detail of his explanation to be accepted as fact. That is enough to explain why the alarm evidence matters, without pretending the surviving scene reveals the entire sequence. The larger mechanism doesn't depend on every disputed trick being true. The crew still had legitimate reconnaissance success. Several defenses were neutralized. The alarm never produced the expected response, and the door was opened without the obvious damage investigators would expect from a direct attack. Later retellings sometimes present every bypass as settled fact, but the record is less complete. Scott Selby, who co-wrote a book on the case and later reviewed Notarbartolo's account for a recent documentary, said the combination lock remained the biggest mystery for him. Notarbartolo's own explanation involves a hidden camera, but researchers have questioned whether his version could have worked as described. What investigators could see was that individual protections had been interfered with separately. A camera can't help if its useful recording is removed. A door sensor can't protect a room if the door is opened in a way that leaves the sensor satisfied. Motion and heat detection matter only if the devices receive the information they were designed to notice. By the time the crew acted, the individual devices were still installed, but enough of the signals reaching the monitoring chain no longer represented what was happening in the vault. The timing helped. The robbery took place over the weekend of February 15th and 16th, when the Diamond Center was far quieter than during the working week. Time's account of the documentary describes reduced activity around the building on weekends, even though the vault itself remained protected. Fewer people nearby meant a narrower chance that somebody would notice what the electronics had missed. By late Saturday, that period had arrived. Wired's reconstruction places the crew inside the building after midnight, reaching the underground level, without an alarm response or a guard stopping the job. At some point, the main vault door opened, and the men entered a room that was still supposed to be protected by several independent sensors. Getting through that door didn't finish the job. Rows of individually locked safe deposit boxes were still waiting inside. Time's later summary describes a purpose-built tool for forcing the individual boxes, while Wired's reconstruction describes a hand-operated device working through the locks. The accounts differ on the tool, but both describe the same practical limit. Forcing each box took time. The thieves spent hours pulling out diamonds, jewelry, cash, and other valuables, and they still didn't empty the entire room. When daylight approached, time became the problem. Antwerp would soon fill again with workers, dealers, and vehicles, and every extra minute underground increased the chance that somebody would arrive before they were gone. So the crew left boxes unopened and carried away what they could move. When Pays and De Breiker entered the vault on Monday, the amount left on the floor suggested the thieves had reached the limit of what they could carry. The police estimate eventually put the loss at about $100 million. Although Notarbartolo later claimed the real haul was much smaller, because the diamond trade included off-book transactions and incomplete insurance claims, the exact total has never been cleanly settled. The alarm contradiction now had a partial answer. Different defenses had been dealt with separately, and by Monday morning, the monitoring company's system was still showing a vault that looked secure. The attack had never produced the kind of alarm state investigators expected to see after a room like this had been entered. After the crew left the building, the investigation turned on a mistake that had nothing to do with the vault. If you like procedural crime stories where the case turns on evidence rather than mythology, subscribe. The clue that breaks this one starts outside the vault, in a place the crew never expected investigators to search. On Sunday evening, according to Notarbartolo's later account, he and an accomplice were driving south on the E19 motorway with a garbage bag full of material connected to the heist. The plan was to destroy it. He said they pulled off near a wooded strip north of Brussels, where his nervous companion began scattering the contents rather than waiting to burn everything properly. The exact behavior in the woods comes mainly from Notarbartolo, so it can't be treated as an independently verified scene. The rubbish itself was very real. Papers, videotape, foreign currency, food packaging, and other material ended up on land owned by August Van Camp, a retired grocer who regularly complained to police about people dumping trash there. On Monday morning, February 17th, Van Camp found another mess in the undergrowth. He saw videotape, a partly eaten salami sandwich, and envelopes bearing the name of the Antwerp Diamond Center. When he called the police and mentioned those envelopes, a routine litter complaint suddenly became relevant to the biggest case in the district. By that afternoon, detectives were collecting the debris. Torn paper led them to an invoice for a low-light surveillance system purchased in Leonardo Notarbartolo's name. Another piece of evidence carried the contact information of Elio Denorio, an Italian electronics specialist later linked to the case. Investigators also preserved the sandwich and salami packaging. The contrast with the vault was almost embarrassing. The crew had prepared carefully for cameras, sensors, and alarms, then left names, receipts, packaging, and business records in ordinary trash beside a motorway. Detectives no longer had to solve the entire heist before they could identify suspects. They could keep following the objects the crew had discarded. That mattered because the evidence didn't all depend on the same story. The surveillance invoice pointed toward Notarbartolo, while Denorio's contact information opened a second line of inquiry involving someone with electronics expertise. Both clues could be checked against records that existed outside the thieves' own account. Investigators could compare names with travel, telephone, and property evidence rather than asking one witness to explain an impossible vault. The rubbish also changed the order of the investigation. Detectives no longer needed a complete technical reconstruction before making progress. They could work backward from ordinary records while specialists continued examining the vault. That's a much easier problem for police. A disputed explanation of a sensor can stay disputed, while a receipt still has a timestamp. A phone still connects to a cell tower, and a certified diamond can still be traced back to the vault it came from. Notarbartolo then made their job easier by returning to Antwerp. Wired reported that his plan had always been to bring back his rental car, show his face at the Diamond Center so he wouldn't stand out as a tenant who disappeared after the robbery, and clean the apartment more thoroughly. He didn't know that the surveillance equipment invoice had already led Belgian police to ask Italian authorities to search his home near Turin. On February 21st, he entered the Diamond Center using his normal access.
This is your last
A
chance.
guard who knew police were asking about him alerted the building manager, and the manager kept Notarbartolo talking until investigators arrived. Pays and De Breiker began questioning him. He claimed difficulty with French and said he couldn't remember the exact address of his apartment. So the detectives put him in a car and had him guide them there. When they reached the building, his wife and several friends were coming out with bags. One of them carried a rolled carpet. Police detained the group and searched what they had. During the apartment search, detectives found a grocery receipt for the same brand of salami, whose packaging had been recovered near the motorway. The receipt carried a timestamp. They checked the store's security video at that time and saw Ferdinando Finato buying the product, giving them another person to investigate. The evidence quickly became more concrete. Investigators found prepaid SIM cards linked to phones used almost exclusively to contact 3 other Italians: Donorio, Finato, and Pietro Tavano. Cell tower records showed all 3 phones, along with Notarbartolo's, in the Diamond District on the night of the heist. That gave detectives something the vault could not. A security bypass can be argued over for years because several technical explanations may fit the same damaged sensor. Telephone records are different. They can place devices in the same area and show patterns of contact between people. The records didn't prove what each man physically did underground, but they gave investigators a structure they could compare with the trash evidence and the stolen property recovered in searches. Italian police were also searching Notarbartolo's home near Turin. Inside a safe, they found 17 polished diamonds attached to certificates that Belgian detectives traced back to the vault. More gemstones were recovered from the rolled carpet taken from the Antwerp apartment. The case spread from there. French police searching the home of Finato's girlfriend recovered marked $100 bills that Belgian investigators said belonged to a Diamond Center customer. Donorio denied taking part in the robbery, but his DNA was found on adhesive material left inside the vault. The salami receipt, phone records, stolen property, and physical evidence didn't explain every security trick, but they gave prosecutors a chain connecting people, locations, and property. Belgian courts convicted Notarbartolo of orchestrating the heist and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Donorio, Finato, and Tavano received 5-year sentences. Investigators also concluded that a 5th participant had been involved based on phone records and DNA traces, but they never identified him. The convictions also show why the case could move forward without a perfect replay of the burglary. Prosecutors didn't have to demonstrate every sensor bypass in sequence before the physical and communications evidence became useful. The phone records linked the group. Certified diamonds and marked cash-connected recovered property to the vault. DNA connected Donorio to material left inside. The technical mystery remained, but the evidence around the people involved had become much harder to explain away. Those convictions answered the question of who could be prosecuted. They didn't answer the question that mattered to the people whose boxes had been opened. Almost all of the stolen diamonds remained missing. Time reported in 2025 that many box owners hadn't insured their holdings because the Diamond Center was considered one of the safest places to store diamonds. And some victims were small dealers whose businesses were wiped out by the loss. That detail changes the human scale of the story. The public number makes the heist sound like a loss absorbed by an industry, but the vault was divided into individual boxes owned by individual businesses. Security had concentrated their valuables in one place because that place was supposed to reduce risk. For a small dealer, the contents of one box could represent working inventory rather than a passive investment. Losing it meant losing. The stones needed to keep trading, while the criminal case moved on a completely different timetable. The convictions didn't restore the missing inventory or the trading capital tied up in it. The missing loot also keeps Notarbartolo's insurance scheme story from being settled by the property itself. He insisted the crew found far less than police estimated, and claimed other dealers had removed valuables before the robbery. Researchers and investigators have questioned that account, and no complete recovery of the stolen property has resolved the argument. Almost all of the diamonds remain unaccounted for. A second uncertainty remains around the entry itself. Investigators never reconstructed every step used to defeat the vault. Notarbartolo eventually described hidden cameras, sensor tricks, and other preparations, but parts of his account are disputed, so the technical sequence remains incomplete. That's why the alarm call from the first morning still matters. The detectives were standing inside an open vault while the company monitoring it reported that the system was functioning and secure. The vault had cameras, guards, movement detection, heat detection, a seismic sensor, magnetic monitoring, and a massive steel door because its owners didn't trust any single defense. The crew neutralized different protections at different moments, and enough of the monitoring chain continued to see normal conditions that no alarm response arrived. For one weekend, a system built from layered defenses kept reporting confidence while the room it was protecting was being emptied.